In today's video, I'm going to show you how to start watercolor painting with absolutely zero knowledge. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things drawing, all things watercolor, lots of mixed media. Please do consider subscribing. It's completely free, and unlike many channels here on YouTube, we are fully cat approved. Learning to paint in watercolors can seem really daunting. It can seem like there's just so much information out there. You just get more and more confused. You don't know where to start. In this video, I'm going to show you how to go from absolutely zero knowledge to getting started in painting. But also, if you've done a little bit and you just really feel like you're going around in circles, we're going to boil it down to 6 main things that you need to understand. So let's get started. You don't need many paints to get started, so let's look at paint first. So I've got some watercolor paints here, and these ones are in tubes. You may also have seen these little ones that you get in blocks. This size is called half pan. You also get double this size, which is full pan. Your tubes will come in anything from 5mm up to 20mm, depending on what the manufacturer wants to put out. You also have the option with the tubes of squeezing them out into a palette like this. If you've bought something that doesn't look anything like that, it looks more like this, chances are it's a very cheap set with very poor pigments. That's not an exact rule because there are hundreds of manufacturers and they put out all sorts of things. Generally speaking, most of the good paints come either in tubes or those little blocks. And you can buy empty tins such as this one that you can place those in. This one's actually meant for tubes, but you can also get empty tins for pans or blocks. And any good art manufacturer or website will sell the colours individually. If you're looking to buy a set, I want to warn you very strongly not to go to one of those cheap websites that sells everything from, pot plants to phone chargers to skirts. Don't be tempted to buy one of these huge sets that's got 50 colours in. You're just going to be buying rubbish, and the pigment is the expensive bit, so that's what you're going to be losing out on. Far better to buy a small set. What you're looking for is something called a split primary set. This is going to give you 2 of each of your primary colours, a warm and cool version of blue, yellow and red, enabling you to mix a wide range of colours. Some of those sets also have a few earth colours in, so you're going to get between 6 and 10 colours of a really good quality. Always go for a proper art manufacturer, a proper brand. Most of them have an artist range of colours. Some of them also have student sets. And whilst the pigments in those are a little less pricey, they're still, way above anything that you'll buy from one of those cheap shops. Far better to get just a few colours, get used to mixing them, making new colours, and then you can buy more in the future when you want to. Now, after paint, we need to choose the right paper. So let's talk about paper. I've got a scrap of watercolor paper here. So if you're using water, it's important that you use proper watercolor paper. Some of the cheap papers really do sort of start to fall apart a little bit as you paint on them. That doesn't mean you need the most expensive paper in the world, but again, you want to get a properly recognized brand. The most expensive papers are made of cotton and they're highly durable. Cheaper ones are made of wood pulp paper. They're not too bad for practice, but as soon as you start scrubbing at them or trying to remove mistakes, they're going to start sort of beading up. Now, you might have seen that watercolor paper has a slight bumpy surface. That's really important because it's going to help the pigment to spread and dry evenly. You can get smooth watercolor paper. It's called hot press paper, but I don't recommend it, certainly not for beginners. It's really quite hard to paint on. It doesn't show up the beautiful pigments, and it doesn't help the paint to sit evenly and the pigments to spread evenly. So you want to make sure you're using a standard, slightly bumpy surface. This surface is generally called cold pressed, but it's sometimes called not, N-O-T, which just stands for not hot pressed. Once you start to paint on your paper, if you're using a larger piece, you may find it goes slightly bumpy. This is completely normal. It can be avoided by something called paper stretching. You can stretch your paper onto board. I've done that here with this stretched board of paper. It's really quite easy. I'll leave a link in the video description to a video that will tell you how to do that. You can also buy your paper in something called blocks so that it's kind of gummed around the edge, which will stop it from buckling and wrinkling a little bit. Paper also comes in loose sheets and in spiral bound or gummed pads. you can really end up paying a lot for paper. Now, here in the UK, and I would say this goes for anywhere like America, Europe, anywhere where you're in a big city, you're going to probably find that buying loose sheets of paper online are cheaper. Now, I have said this in the past on YouTube, and some people that have lived out, if you're on an island in the middle of nowhere and it really is not very easy to do things like order off of Amazon, then you may actually find that your local shop that has a pad of watercolor paper will end up being cheaper for you. So do your research, shop around, and make sure that you always paint on watercolor paper. If you paint on drawing paper, sketch pad paper, what they sometimes call cartridge paper, then you're simply going to end up making holes in the paper because it's not meant to withstand the water in the same way that this nice, thick quality watercolor paper is. There's an awful lot of artificial intelligence out there at the moment, isn't there? So if you appreciate real YouTubers, real experts bringing you real content here on YouTube, please do click the like button, share, subscribe, or leave a comment. All of those things are free, and all of those things will help me to make more free content that helps more people learn to paint and draw. And now let's get back to today's tutorial. There must be 20 or 30 different types of watercolor brush out there. Luckily for you, we only need one or two. Let's talk about brushes. Now, there are dozens of types of brushes. There are sword liners and riggers and filberts and all sorts of strange shapes, but you really only need a brush like this to start with. This is your traditional watercolor painting brush. It's called a round brush, even though it has pointed end, because it's round as it goes into this metal part here. If you want to go on from that, another useful type of brush is a flat brush. This is especially useful when you're doing large areas of painting, and also when you want to apply water to your paper before painting, as you sometimes do with watercolor painting. And you want to practice some basic brush strokes, so you want to be looking at just using enough paint that you can keep a line going for some time. I have a video all about my favorite 5 types of painting brush. I also have a video about basic brush strokes that you can start with. I'll leave those in the description of this video. The brushes I use are always synthetic. I don't believe in using animal hair brushes because they are a product of the fur trade. So this one is synthetic. You'll see there are sizes on these brushes. Unfortunately, that doesn't always mean much because there's no consistency across brands. But if I could only have one watercolor brush, it would be a brush like this. This one's a size 12, so somewhere around a 10 or a 12. As I said, you'll get a little variation between brands. That's all you need to start with. The best way to learn about your paints is to swatch them. Let me show you how it works. Now, when you start to get into watercolor painting, you'll hear all sorts of things about granulating colors, about staining colors, about semi-opaque colors, and it can be really overwhelming and confusing. The easiest way to get to know the colors that you have, which is all that matters really, is to swatch them. Now, I've got this nice tube of French ultramarine here. But even though this is an excellent brand, it's a brand that I work with, label printing is limited. You can't usually tell what color something is by looking on the label. It's going to give you an approximation, but I've seen some real differences between the color as it actually looks on the paper and how it looks in the tube. And even if you have block paint or you've squeezed your paint out like this paint here, it's still really hard, especially with the dark colors, to know what on earth you're going to get when you put it on the paper. Now, I've drawn a line on this paper with a permanent black marker pen, and what you can do as well is you can swatch across a black line, and that'll tell you how transparent your color is. Now, we'll look at the line in a moment, but first of all, let's look at how you actually swatch a color. So the idea of swatching a color is to see how it looks when it's really, really strongly pigmented. So I've got this dark color here. Do you know, it's so long since I've used this palette, I can't remember what color this is. It's a really interesting color, isn't it? The name is on the tip of my tongue. It will come to me. Meantime, let's just swatch it and see how it looks. What I'm doing here is I'm rinsing my brush, and you always want to have some paper towel or rag on hand, and I'm just drying it a little bit, and I can sort of water down and try and get my paint as watery as possible. So I can now see what this color looks like at full strength, and I can see what it looks like as it gets weaker. Could also, if you want to, rather than go from strong to weak like that, you could do it in stages. So we could go strong, less strong, but more and more water in as we go down. Look at the difference with this Winsor & Newton transparent yellow, which actually ends up looking dark brown when you squeeze it out in the palette and it dries. And look at the difference between that and this. So making some swatches is really going to teach you about your paints. And if you want to test transparency, you can paint them across a permanent marker line like this, and then just wait for them to dry and see how clear that line looks. Let me grab a little bit of Potter's Pink here, which is a very opaque colour. And I think straight away on camera, even before it's dried, you can see the difference there between that one and the blue violet that I put next to it. Now, there's nothing wrong with semi-opaque paint. It's not better or worse than transparent paint. The same goes for granulation, which is where you get little pigments that end up showing on your paper. This cerulean blue is a granulating colour. I'll hold it closer to the camera so you can see those little paint granules. Again, there's nothing wrong with that colour. They're often made from natural pigments, so they will have different properties, and that's part of the beauty of watercolour painting. But the more you can swatch and play with your colours, the more you'll understand what they look like. And then, of course, you can take the swatching one step further and mix the colours together and see what you get. There's one fundamental thing to understand about the order that you put your colours on the paper, and that's that you need to work light to dark. Let's look at why this is and how it works. So here I am working on one of my own paintings. It's a puffin, isn't he cute? Now, watercolour paints are transparent, which means we can't work in the same way that we might work with an acrylic or an oil painting. So, for example, I can't paint all of this blue background across everything and then put the white bird on top or any of these light green leaves. They simply won't paint over the top. It's transparent, so you'll just see the dark blue through them. So what we do with watercolour painting is we work light to dark. Now, it sounds complicated, but it really isn't as long as you follow that rule. What are the lightest areas on the picture? First of all, we've got the very pale area. We've got the white bird. I can just avoid painting him and use the white of the paper. We've got these lighter plants here. So let's look at how I'm doing this. You can see that I've painted these very pale stems and buds in first. And what I'm going to do now is, in a few places, the darker leaves behind kind of go around them. So I'm going to pick those colours out. But if you're not good at painting as precisely as this, don't worry, practice makes perfect. And there are also other things that you can use that will help you, like masking fluid. The important thing for now is just to understand the concept of working from the light areas first to the darker areas. If you always go back to that rule, you won't get in too much trouble. Let's look now at a secret weapon that we can use with our watercolour paintings that's going to make everything easier, and that is watercolour pencils. So let's continue with my painting and let me show you one of my favourite and most time-saving tricks. Now, lots of people use watercolour paintings on their own to make a little picture with, and that's a lovely thing to do. I have tutorials and courses all about using watercolour pencils, but not that many people take advantage of actually using them alongside their watercolour paints, and they are such a time saver. Because if, for example, I have veins on this leaf that I want to paint in, I would have to let this layer dry and find a really tiny brush and try and copy them. Really quite difficult. Whereas in reality, I can just take my watercolour pencil straight into my paint and draw some beautiful, delicate fine lines. So much easier and so much more natural looking than using a paintbrush. So do let me know in the comments if you've tried watercolour paints yet, or if you're going to give them a go now. And before you leave this video, don't forget to pop into the video description. I've got all sorts of free stuff down there. You can download some free PDFs or even take a free watercolour painting course. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're going to enjoy my video all about watercolour brushstrokes. You can watch that one right now.